Okay, today we're going to be reviewing light logic and value and how value can describe form. So we're looking at this sphere because it's the clearest, simplest, smoothest way to go over these different parts of light and shadow and how they interact. We're going to start out by talking about the light shape and the shadow shape. So I used each of these terms to contain all the parts of light and shadow to keep things simple. When we start a drawing, we want to look for just these two shapes and how they inform each other. Simplicity is key. A simple drawing is a flexible drawing, so we won't start out looking at the highlight or reflected light or the differences between the different kinds of shadows. We're just going to look at the light shape and the shadow shape. So when I use these terms, again, it's containing all those components of both the light shape and the shadow shape. So the light shape is just referring to everything that the light is touching. Everything within the highlight, everything just outside of the highlight, all the way up to the edge of where the form shadow begins. The shadow shape contains everything that the light can't see. So that includes both the form shadow and the cast shadow, the reflected light within it, the line of the core shadow. All of those fit into the larger shadow shape. So again, I'll use these two terms to keep things simple. I'll use these two terms most often when I'm talking about light and shadow. So be aware of how the light shape and the shadow shape inform each other. We'll talk more next week about how to design these shapes to kind of fit our composition. But for now, remember all those other terms fit within these two categories. So the highlight is the closest area of an object to the light source. Depending on the surface texture of the object, it's going to be more specular and with sharper edges like this one here. It's a little bit glossier, so it's smaller and more contained. A different texture on the surface of the object might have a highlight that's more spread out and more subtle with a slower transition and fall off of light into the larger light shape around it. The core shadow is going to be the deepest, darkest part of the shadow on the object here. So think of the core shadow as the horizon line of what the light source can see of this object. So in astronomy, they talk about the terminator line, which is like the line of what the sun is illuminating on either the moon or the planets. So if you think of that line as a horizon line, like when we are looking at the sunset on the ocean, right when the sun starts to dip below the horizon line, you're entering the core shadow of planet Earth. So think of it how it relates to the light source. It's just outside of what the light can see, and it's just the form turning away from that light source into total shadow here. So there is some reflected light, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That's going to have there's different value shifts within the larger shadow shape, but the core shadow is going to be the darkest part of that form shadow as the object turns away from the light source. There's no more light touching it right at that line. This line is going to tell us a lot about the shape of the object, the angle of the light source, the proximity of the object to the light source, and again, the surface texture and what that's going to inform us about the different kinds of edges we could be using. We'll talk more about edges next week, but whether it's a softer edge, a more firm edge, or a sharper edge, that tells us about the transitions on the planes of the object and how steep or gradual those different slopes might be. So the core shadow is really what defines that line between light and dark. Sometimes it's subtle and harder to detect, and we kind of have to make a choice about where that transition is from light to dark. Sometimes it's really, really clear. So the core shadow is at the core of the shadow. It's as the object turns away from the light source. So within our larger shadow shape, we have two different kinds of shadows. So when we talk about the larger shadow shape, think about what you see here when you squint. That whole shadow kind of melts into one, that reflected light, the difference between the sphere itself and the shadow on the ground plane. The difference kind of goes away when we squint. When we look more closely, we can see that there's two different shadows happening here at once. The form shadow is the shadow on the form of the object. It's on the object itself. So as the form of the sphere turns away from the light source, right in this area here, we call this the form shadow. It's a little bit smoother and slower of an edge, of a smoother and slower transition. The cast shadow is the shadow cast onto the ground plane here. So a cast shadow is the object casting a shadow onto any adjacent surface or object or shape or whatever it is. If you think about the shadow or the way the light hits your own arms, if it's being lit by the sun outside, you're going to have a shadow on your arm as the form of your arm turns away from the light, but you're also going to have a shadow of your arm on the ground. So the shadow on your arm would be the form shadow. The silhouette of your shadow on the ground in front of you would be the cast shadow. Another way to think about that is if you're making a shadow puppet on the wall, the light that's going to be on your hands is going to have a form shadow on the back side of your hand as it turns away from the light, but then the actual shadow on the wall is going to be the cast shadow. So knowing the difference between these two is going to be useful. Again, when we're designing our shadow shapes, we can think about how separate we want to make these two. Maybe they sort of melt together, maybe they're more distinct. Whatever serves our composition, it's going to be up to us in the end. But knowing the difference between the two is, again, it's going to tell you a lot about the object and the shape of it and the surface texture of it, but also it's going to tell you a lot about the light source, even if you can't see the light source. It's rare in a drawing or painting of any kind that we're going to actually see the light source itself. So if we know where it's coming from and we understand how the objects are reacting to it, it's going to tell us, it's going to be a lot easier to simplify. And that's really what we want to do, is simplify what we see so we can understand it better. So the reflected light is light that is bouncing back into the shadow from the surfaces around it. So the ground plane here is getting hit with the same light as the sphere itself. That light is bouncing back off of the ground and up into the shadow here of the sphere. So it's a little bit lighter than the shadow around it, but remember, when we squint, it's still darker than everything in the light shape. It's still part of the larger shadow shape, that larger umbrella term. The shadow as a whole, the reflected light fits into that. Another way to remember this, going back to thinking about the moon and how the light hits the moon, when a full moon is illuminating the night sky and you can see shadows at nighttime, that's reflected light. Light's bouncing off of the moon into the shadow of the earth. So it's indirect light. It's really subtle. Again, when we squint, it's harder to detect. So this is later on in our drawing, after we've established that larger light shape and shadow shape. So reflected light is part of the shadow shape. So I want everyone to be on the same page with all these different terms and what they mean. Remember that the highlight is part of the larger light shape. The core shadow, reflected light, is within the larger shadow shape. And a form shadow and a cast shadow are different kinds of shadows. They're different edge qualities that a shadow can have. So they're both pieces of that larger shadow shape. So our goal here is to understand all these different pieces and make them all work together so that when we're drawing, we can describe a three-dimensional form really specifically. And we can call out certain details that we might find more useful in our composition. We want to understand where the light is coming from and how it's affecting all these different shapes that we're seeing with all these different kinds of edges. Remember, if we can simplify what we're seeing, our drawing will be more flexible and we'll be able to design our picture and translate what we see rather than just copy it. So if we take that light logic from that image of that sphere and we apply it to the picture of these two apples, our goal is not just to be able to draw this well, but our overarching goal for drawing anything is to understand what we see. So we'll think about the direction of the light source, how it's affecting these apples and the fabric behind it, how those different textures are creating different kinds of edges, and how the light falls off as it turns away from the light source and creates those shadow shapes that we're seeing. So similar to last week when I'm starting out on this drawing, I'm trying to use really simple lines, making really simple construction lines to try and lay out the composition here. Thinking about how each of these objects relates to the frame around it and the corners. So I'm looking at the four corners and the proximity of the edge of the apple. I'm using those stripes as a guide and the positive and negative space of that light and dark pattern of those stripes on the fabric. Thinking about the negative space around the shapes of the apples and not just focusing in on the shapes of the apples themselves. It's going to be tempting to just dive in and just try and draw the apple as perfectly as you possibly can from the start, but try and stay zoomed out. Look at the big picture. Try and see the whole picture at once. It's not easily done and it's going to take a few tries, so you'll see me erasing here and there. Just slowly trying to step back, look at the big picture. Anything that needs to be corrected, I'll make those corrections. And then I'll correct my corrections over and over until everything feels like it's more or less in the right place. But until I get to that point, I'm not going to dive into any surface details or worry about any light or shadow shapes just yet. I just want to get everything in the right spot. So you can see some of those straight line construction lines I'm drawing there just to keep things simple. Really subtle curves are probably one of the hardest things to draw. So if you break them up into straight lines, it makes things simpler, especially in this beginning phase. So it might be a long, subtle curve. You can just use a straight line to describe that and then turn that straight line into two lines and then turn two lines into four lines and so on. And the object will get more complex and that curve will become more and more accurate over time. Trying to keep everything light and soft. I'm anticipating all the mistakes I'm going to be making. Which helps me get a little bit more accurate with each line that I draw. We'll talk more about measuring and positive and negative space and perspective later on in the semester. For now, we just want to get this to a point where it feels like it's close enough that we can explore those light and shadow shape transitions we talked about earlier. So the more time you spend trying to get that simple but accurate, or I should say accurate but simple, the more time you spend trying to get that simple drawing down, that foundational layer, the easier it's going to be later on to layer that complexity on top of it. If you start out with a drawing that's complicated, it's just going to make it a lot harder for that drawing to evolve. That's why I keep saying that a simple drawing is a flexible drawing. It's easier to make changes. If you were building a house, you
Okay,
would,
I found this on the web for if you're building.
if you were building a house, you would start from the ground up. You wouldn't start off with adding a doorknob or painting a wall. You'd have to start with a solid concrete foundation. You would build up the framing of the walls. Painting the front door would be one of the last things that you do. So similarly, when we're starting a drawing, we have to start from the ground up, drawing these forms from the inside out, make sure everything's in the right spot before we add layers on top of this. So when you feel like your drawing's at a point where everything feels like it's in more or less the right spot, you've kind of made your way around the composition multiple times and you feel like everything is where it needs to be, you can start thinking about that larger light shape versus shadow shape relationship. So I'm mapping out the shadow here. You can see there's a cast shadow between the two apples, and then there's a smaller one to the left side of the apple on the left. I'm going to start to fill those in as one generic light midtone. So if you think about the value scale, this first pass is just going to be like a light midtone on the lighter half of the value scale. Remember, we want to keep our drawing pretty light and soft in the beginning. Even as we start to add in these shadows, we still want some room to maneuver if we have to. So what I'm going to do is try and simplify all the shadows into one generic shadow shape for one layer, really. I'm not worried about a form shadow versus a cast shadow. I'm just looking at the reference image and I'm squinting and thinking about how can I merge all those shadows together and unify them into one shape. So there's a little bit of a form shadow here on this apple, so that too I'm going to include that. Even though they're subtle, you can kind of see how the form of the apple turns away from the highlight, turns away from the light source. So you can think of this stage as just being like a map of all the shadow shapes. Looking back and forth from the drawing to the reference photo, you can see there's a long way to go with building up that light and dark pattern, pushing the shadows a lot darker. So first I'm just going to map everything out with a pretty light mid-tone. And this will help me just see if everything makes sense. A shadow doesn't have to be dark for the light logic to make sense. So I want to think about all these different shapes and how they create the design of the composition, not just in turning the form of the apples and making them look three-dimensional, but I just want to make sure all the light and dark shapes fit together in the way that I want. So I'm using the side edge of the tip of the pencil again. Last week we talked a lot about contour lines. We're going to try and be less linear today. Last week we used those contour lines to kind of show the difference between one object to the next with all those different leaves. So it's going to be tempting today to go really dark with the same kind of contour line to show the difference between the apple and the fabric behind it. So try to ignore that impulse today. Use the side of your pencil to build up these tones and think more about shapes than lines. Remember, drawing with the side of your pencil makes it easier to create larger shapes. The lines and shapes define each other. So every time we draw a line, we create a shape on either side, even whether it's positive or negative space. So similarly, sort of in an inverse way, we can create lines by putting two shapes next to each other. So the stripes on the fabric show that pretty clearly. So I'm using the larger pencil now to get even a larger edge out of the tip of the pencil here. So even though I'm trying to darken everything, I'm using a really light touch to build up these layers of adding more value. I want to do that really slowly. Our goal here is to show changes in form using those different gradations of value. Might feel challenging or frustrating after focusing so much on line to then totally ignore it. So we're kind of coming at it from this opposite end. The more we can surrender to these exercises, you're going to get more out of each of these different ways of drawing and different ways of seeing. Think of them like different tools in the toolbox. Because then when they all blend together and you're not really aware of the different kind of drawing you might be doing, you'll be able to draw a lot more intuitively. So here, where those two apples meet, we want to use that cast shadow between them to show the difference between the two apples. The apple on the right has a form shadow that starts turning away from the light source, and then it meets that cast shadow in the middle. That's a lot darker. That cast shadow on the left side of the left apple is similar as well. So again, try and show that plane change or show that shift in the form using a different value, a darker value next to a slightly less dark value, instead of just carving out a line to show the edge of that apple. A lot of these lines look sort of hatchy and linear. I'm just trying to cover the surface of the paper as gently as I can with the side of the pencil. I can blend that in a bit later using a paintbrush. I like to use a bristle brush. I'm not going to use my finger to blend it because there's oil in my finger, and that's going to act as a binder from the graphite into the paper. It's going to bind the two together, and it's going to be impossible to erase. So if you have an old paintbrush lying around, you can use that to move those little particles of graphite across the paper. You could use a blending stump. You could use a Q-tip, although a Q-tip's going to be really small. But use something that does this in a dry and also uniform way. I have a couple different brushes that I use. This one's a little bit soft, so the bristle brushes are a little bit harsher. But just think about how the brush is moving the charcoal across the page. This will give the drawing a nice even tone, and it'll be easier to go back in with the eraser afterwards, and you can use the eraser into that even tone and carve out the light shapes just like we carve out the shadow shapes in the beginning. And that process can just go back and forth over and over, and the drawing will get more and more realized over time. So if you're not loving the hatching texture your pencil marks might be making, use a large brush like this to push back those sharper textures. The drawing might end up looking a little foggy like this. That's okay, because we can just go back in with our eraser and the pencil and just pull out all those edges that we want to focus on. So what I'll do from here is I'll just go into all those shadow shapes, all those transitions we've already established, and I'm just going to turn up the volume on the darker values. I'm going to use the eraser to maintain those light shapes. There's those two highlights on the apples and then the fabric, the white of the fabric behind them. The more I brush the graphite around, or if you're using charcoal, same thing, the more we put down that even tone with the paintbrush, the more those highlights are going to get covered up and smudged around. So keep maintaining those lighter values using your eraser. So from here I can just repeat the process over again. I'm going to use that larger pencil again. That's a little bit darker, I think. And I'm just going to go in and carve out some of those sharper edges, some of those darker shadows within the shadows I've already established. A good way to see where you can get darker is to look at your drawing and look at the reference photo and look back and forth, shift your eyes back and forth really quickly, and you'll notice how much lighter or darker something needs to get, or if something's out of proportion too. So hopefully that's not an issue. You can see I mapped out that shadow shape right there, that cast shadow on the fabric, as sort of like a graphic little shape to show that the shadow sort of reaching behind that apple there. There's also some edges that I'm holding back on, where I just erased that fabric is passing in front of the apple. We don't have to draw a line across that whole section. We can show that there's a difference between those planes and between those different objects. We can show that difference with just the change in value alone. We don't have to have a line, a continuous line, carving out a boundary around the whole contour of each object. So experiment with holding back on that. Sometimes the values of the two areas are the same. We call that a lost edge. We'll experiment with that more next week. But here I'm just trying to push the value of that cast shadow. It's one of the darkest areas in the whole picture. So I'm going to get out a slightly darker pencil. This is going to be a 6B graphite pencil. Whatever pencil you're using, you can keep pushing the values by just adding more and more graphite. If you reach a point where you feel like you can't get any darker, that's okay. Just think about how you can sharpen up different edges. So like right there, I'm kind of going in and carving out different corners of that shadow shape. But if you want to take your drawing further, you can take it to a slightly softer graphite, or if you're using charcoal, you can use a slightly softer charcoal. It's the same material, it just comes off the pencil faster. So for the sake of the demo, I'm going to use it just because it's going to speed things up a little bit. So I had to tilt the paper a little bit because of the glare from the lights on the graphite. So just by pushing that one little value a little bit darker behind the apple creates a lot of space. Even though it's a pretty shallow, there's pretty shallow depth of field here, it adds a lot of depth. So it doesn't have to be a big landscape to have a lot of depth. Showing where things overlap can really go a long way in creating the illusion of space on your paper. Even though this is darker graphite, I'm drawing really, really gently. I don't want to overdo it. I'm not trying to gouge a pathway into the paper itself. Just adding some darker graphite on top of what I already have. From here, I'm just trying to maintain those light shapes. As I keep drawing, the graphite keeps getting moved around, or if you're using charcoal, that too is going to make the paper darker in general. So maintain those light shapes with your eraser throughout the whole drawing process. And keep stepping back. Look at your whole composition. Think about what's interesting to you in the photo. Whether you're conscious of it or not, you're going to pick up those things and leave what you're not interested in. But if you think about what draws you in most about this picture, at this stage in the drawing when we're starting to finish things up, that's where you can really be specific about. The viewer's going to go wherever the contrast is, so the contrast is going to be in those bigger swings in value, so where you're going from light to dark faster. So think about where the edges might be sharper, where you're going from light to dark more abruptly. And just remember that a drawing is representing not just what we see, but how we see it. So think about how you want to guide the viewer through this image. I'm using some lines here, even though I said not to. As I finish the drawing, I like kind of carving out those, or calling out those different positive and negative shapes of the stripes. Using that line versus shape duality to drive us around the composition. I don't want it to take away from the apples themselves, so I'm drawing pretty lightly still. And I'm thinking about the gesture of the fabric, how those shapes kind of move us through from one area of the picture plane to the other. So don't underestimate how powerful empty space can be. Like this whole area over here. Just because something is simple doesn't mean it's vacant or useless. So don't be trying to fill in any empty areas. So use that quietness and that silence of like a big empty shape to help balance things out. So take your time, enjoy the process. Try and hold back on getting too linear too quickly, and build up that form using just gradations and value as best you can. Use the brush to blend things together and try and get some nice seamless transitions on those apples. Remember to take deep breaths and just pay attention. Using the blue tape isn't required, but I like how it makes a nice clean frame for my drawing, especially when I'm using the brush in the way that we did. Have fun, and I'll talk to you all next week.